Well, welcome everybody. It's very good to see such a fantastic turnout, actually. I thought with the temperature being what it is, and with COVID and with various other things, the general collapse of Grahamstown, for instance, you might not turn out. But it's great to have everybody here. Now, Dan Wylie, an intriguing character, known to us all and beloved by all. One must start with that name, Wylie. He has written books about elephants and crocodiles, but I'm still waiting for the one on foxes. He arrived in the English department as a bright student from Zimbabwe, who had already had to play his part in the Rhodesian Civil War, or perhaps, depending on where your political convictions lie, the Zimbabwean War of Independence, about which he wrote a very interesting book at a very youthful age. Dan was something of a loner, but it was also soon clear that he was the top student of his year, a position he retained for the full 3 years of his undergraduate time. Then he disappeared. We tried very hard to persuade him to stay, but he was gone. Occasionally, we would receive missives or gossip about Dan in the world out there. What we gathered was that he had become passionate about mountains to climb and islands to contemplate. Then, like the prodigal son, after 7 years, he returned, his baggage loaded with sketches and poems. He did honors, started an MA thesis on Shaka Zulu, which was soon promoted to a doctorate, and shortly after into a book. This was in due course followed by a much more extensive study of Shaka Zulu. From here on, his writing progress was bewildering. Books on Sidney Clouts and Don McLennan, several volumes of poetry, of which, for me, the outstanding and most challenging collection was a volume of Portuguese sonnets, which he wrote while a guest of Portugal. Not that he wrote them in Portuguese, but I think the reference to the Brownings as part of the point. More volumes of poetry followed, now interspersed with a series of booklets on elephants and crocodiles in literature. For by now, Dan had become a literary eco-warrior, concerned about how the world is destroying the only planet we have. Tonight, I am happy to say, Dan, who claims that he doesn't know much about Shakespeare, which I don't believe, is going to demonstrate to us both the eco side and the Shakespeare side of his multiple endeavors. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you Dan Wylie.
I actually told Malvern to say, Dan Wylie has not read any Shakespeare for 15 years, which is perfectly true. I must be the least qualified person to have ever addressed this august company, so bear with me. Hope what follows will be mildly entertaining. But thank you for the invitation, and thank you all for coming on this cool night, fabulous turnout. I'm really impressed. All my chums, it's lovely. Okay, I'm going to start entirely self-indulgently with some quasi-autobiography. In 1986, I was able to take up a teaching post, English and history, at a Zimbabwean bush school, a Methodist-run, all-girls, all-shona secondary school about 80 kilometers south of Mutare, which meant that I was the only white Zimbo for about 80 Ks. And my years, they were very, very salutary, a very fruitful experience for me. So much so that I wrote a little book about it called Baobab School, because the school was centered on a huge baobab tree. This is sort of semi-fictionalized. But one of the things, of course, that I found myself doing there, or my fictional alter ego, Douglas Bracewell, finds himself, was teaching Julius Caesar. And this is what happened. If I can find it, of course. No, I'm going to have to use Liz's fantastic glasses. The history syllabus might begin with Marx, Lenin, and Mao, which it did, but our O-level literature syllabus was still essentially British, which meant Shakespeare. I'd loved the 8 or 9 of his plays we'd covered in the 4 years of my degree, and of course I believed implicitly in the great man's universality. Even the Russians appreciated Shakespeare. However, one week and a single scene into Julius Caesar, I realized that we were going to be wading through the verbal equivalent of Sadza. Few of these girls had even heard of Rome, let alone words like tinctures and cognizance and leaf. How on earth to explain the syntactical knottiness and poetic subtleties of lines like, I, your glass, will modestly discover to yourself that of yourself which you yet not know of. Yet I wasn't prepared to do the text the disservice of just spending my nights concocting summaries and obliging the students to learn them by heart, which is the usual way of teaching it. We were going to have to work through it, line by laborious line. I designed whatever I could to enliven things. I found maps of Rome and pictures of Romans, of their tunics and of the daggers that slashed the rents in Caesar's tunic. I unpacked words and phrases and tortuous sentences. I tried to explain the cunning sarcasm in Antony's repetitious dubbing of Brutus as an honorable man, the rhetorical suggestiveness of the repetition itself. We tried to understand what honor means. We skipped certain conversations by assorted commoners, homed in on the vigorous bits. We took the more mobile scenes outside and acted them out, with monondo trees for the forum's pillars. With 50-odd girls in the class, the crowd scenes really were crowded. As the Battle of Philippi unfolded, the baobab concealed whole armies. Certain deserters scuttled off behind the dorms. Imperiously, with a stirring lack of the reticence shown by most of the girls, one girl named Serenade thrust herself forward for the role of Caesar himself. She delivered the dismissal of lean and hungry Cassius, "He knows no plays," with delicious disdain, and was duly slaughtered. I tried to draw parallels with current events, the abuse of power, the dangers of tyranny. I was thinking Herbert Chitepo and Josiah Tongagara, assassinated by accident in the name of the ruling party unity. There had been rumors that Uncle Bob Mugabe himself had been targeted more than once. But it was tricky to press too hard in that direction, even if our headmaster was openly contemptuous of the present government. But it was Brutus, the man of naive nobility, who, his murderous miscalculations notwithstanding, captured the girls' imaginations. Conspiracy and counter-conspiracy, battle, slaughter, and suicides unfolded line by line over weeks, until at last we arrived at the fatal denouement when Brutus groans, "Farewell, good Strato, Caesar, now be still. I killed not thee with half so good a will," dies. And knocked me down with a guinea fowl feather if there weren't tears in some of those girls' eyes. Despite everything, Shakespeare had reached out and snared in them something ineffably human, had held up a glass to emotions within themselves that they knew not of. Months later, you would still hear echoing down the verandas phrases like, "Lend me your ears," or "You blocks, you stones." Now, Julius Caesar wasn't quite the end of Shakespeare in the school experience. The school held an open day, so all the parents rocked up and there were athletics events and so on and so forth. And the day concluded with a performance of a Zimbabwean play, Stephen Chifonyise's Medicine for Love. It's a play written in the 1970s under the auspices of the Rhodesian Literature Bureau. In post-independence Zimbabwe, the Bureau was vilified for being a nasty colonial gatekeeper of what could and could not be published by black writers. It had, nevertheless, given a number of them a leg up. Its constraints might explain the hybrid nature of Medicine for Love, which is in effect a Shona localized version of Romeo and Juliet, with Nganga for friar and well-known natural mutis for the concoctions of Shakespeare's play. It has a similar parallel plot of internecine strife, prescient if one is into historical patterns, star-crossed lovers and tragic outcome, though it's rather lighter in tone, a touch of French farce about it. It worked wonderfully with the girls, with inevitably Serenade as the Juliet figure. And of course it had to be Serenade, who at one crucial point in the plot diverted from script to inject a spontaneous Shona comment. I never found out what it was, no one would say, but it was evidently brilliantly timed, and the uproar nearly blew the leaves off the baobab, in whose lee the play was staged. Over the following week, we took the play on tour to some other district schools. The actors became incrementally adept at following Serenade's example and extemporizing to hilarious effect. By the last night, the tragic structure of the play had been considerably overlaid by loose and unpredictable elements of comedy. As director, I had in the end to relinquish almost all semblance of control and just enjoy the chaos. So, several themes of the talk are foreshadowed here. One, of course, is Shakespeare's perennial presence in Zimbabwe's school syllabi. This is arguably the main vector of his influence in Zimbabwe and elsewhere. As early as 1938, the immigrant priest-poet Arthur Shirley Cripps wrote about tutoring an African schoolboy on Macbeth. At the time, this was very rare. In that same year, Lord Haley reported that only 0.1% of Rhodesian Africans were receiving the kind of education that would include Shakespeare. 60 years later, David Johnson would characterize the post-colonial Shakespeare's presence as residual. So it's like residual of a residue. So while the Bulawayo poet John Apple is still writing study guides to Shakespeare's play in Bulawayo, the bard's influence is perhaps a thinner thread than his iconic status suggests. So you bardolaters, just, calm down. All right? Moreover, school uptake is surely at best diffuse and patchy, ranging from being genuinely moved, like some of my girls, to all degrees of incomprehension. Like many of my young students, I found Shakespeare at school all but impenetrable. The only one available in the then Umtali Boys High School, dusty bookstore at that juncture, was Henry IV, Part 2. The teacher was dismayed, and predictably, we understood absolutely nothing. So it was really only when I got to Rhodes that I studied a Shakespeare play and saw any full productions. I'm just going to mention one other Zimbabwe-related performance, which is memorable. Immediately subsequent to my degree in 1984, I happened to be back in Umtali, which is now Mutare in its post-independence guise, and I was able to see a brilliant production of Twelfth Night by the touring London Shakespeare group. Our once-upon-a-time resident Lawrence Wright mentions this very tour in his essay on Shakespeare in Africa in the Sosa Journal. And I so fell in love with the lass who played viola. Oh, she was like a gazelle, beautiful. That I tried to see the play again in Nairobi, where we happened to coincide, thinking, well, maybe, alas, the rest is... Okay, so much for education. Secondly, the Baobab School extracts shine a sidelight on the post-colonies, welter of scarred memories, willing and unwilling dependencies, contradictions, and creativity. To remind you, Zimbabwe, as a somewhat artificial entity, was from its inception deeply in blood steeped, hence my rather lurid title, which I shall now ignore. Rhodesia was born by cesarean, if you like, in 1890, went through a period of hectic rebellions in the 1890s and early 1900s. Then we had half a century of colonial imposition mingled with development, openly racist land divisions, cultural displacements of all kinds, all culminating in another bloody liberation war or civil war, whatever you like to call it, in the 1970s. And then in 1980, we have another inauguration of 4 years of tyranny under Mugabe and now Mnangagwa, which is also regularly cemented in blood. So the question has always been, how do we speak and write of these things, these layers of irreversible scarring? Depending on who is defined as the we, of course, responses arise on a wide spectrum. At one end of the spectrum, we might encounter an outright traditionalist, a conservative, a localist, who wants to get rid of all foreign influences, foreign languages, foreign mindsets, everything white, everything even globalizing, neo-colonial, whatever, right? So that's one end of the spectrum. At the other end of the spectrum, we might encounter someone who is thoroughly or more thoroughly or completely assimilated to Western modes, Western mores, writes in the colonial language, English, and possibly even lives in an English-speaking country somewhere else, which many of our finest writers do these days. So, of course, almost all writers will fall in between those two extremes somewhere, in some kind of middle ground. Unsettled, unsettling, compromising, creating, conflicted in various ways. The Medicine for Love episode, for example, I think is one kind of middle ground response to those inherent tensions. The modification of the foreign model, the spontaneous defiance of theatrical norms, the eruption or interruption of the local language. So I'd like you to keep this notion of the spectrum in mind as we go along. Okay. Now, I know even less about Zimbabwean theatre than I do about Shakespeare. But in the course of reading up for the talk, I discovered an extensive critical literature on Zimbabwe's quite flourishing drama scene. Some of it comments on Shakespeare's influence. So I'm going to dip opportunistically and very selectively into this field and talk about theatre for a little bit. I'll try not to venture too far down the rabbit hole of post-colonial and decolonial colonial critical theory, much of which is unspeakably dreary and overwrought, and nowadays often laced with unfruitful tones of complaint, recrimination, oversimplification, and an impossible idealism. So having said a few things about theatre, I will then move on to some Zimbabwean poetry that treats of Shakespeare. Now, I mentioned in Baobab School that the Rhodesian Literature Bureau has been regularly disparaged as a center of overbearing colonial control, and so it was to an extent. But there was also wiggle room, opportunities for local innovations. This is at least to judge by an essay on theatrics in a 1966 volume entitled African Writing in Rhodesia by one Adrian Stanley. Now, Stanley was then director of the Salisbury, now Harare, Repertory Players. He had produced an Othello in 1964 and would stage Hamlet in modern dress in 1966. The essay is largely a patronizing litany of instructions for achieving theatrical effectiveness on the conventional Anglo-European, sometimes explicitly Shakespearean, model. But towards the end, Stanley talks briefly about local drama and asserts that we need some badly. What had been staged hitherto he regarded as inept, including a staging he had himself directed of Macbeth as an African tribal play. Interesting crossovers already going on, right? He grumbles, African drama is a great problem. We have got to do something about it. But interestingly, he mentions approvingly Ghanaian vernacular theatre, in which he has been told, the story is written down, the songs and dances and music are all set, but the dialogue is improvised every night by the actors. He couldn't see why it couldn't happen in Rhodesia. Well, voila, it did. 20 years later, my girls are doing it. Now, against Stanley's quintessentially somewhat patronizing Rhodesian stance, we might level a much later, decidedly post-colonial overview. This is a recent 2011 PhD thesis by Zimbabwean scholar Samuel Ravengai. Now, interestingly, Ravengai quite often cites articles by Stanley Chifunjise, who had subsequently taken a quite anti-colonial tone compared to his production of Medicine for Love. Now, Ravengai critiques plays written around that same period, mostly around about 1970, by writers like Paul Chidyausiku, Davidson Mugabe, and accused them almost of being innovative by mimicking Shakespeare. Innovative by mimicking. It's an interesting combination, right? Chidyausiku, for example, employs Hamlet's play within a play technique, in his case, to prove that women can't be entrusted with secrets. Obviously. Some of Mugabe's characters echo Shakespeare's court fools, like Autolycus in The Winter's Tale. Such characters, however, are allegedly, according to Ravengai, misfits in the conservative Shona society of the play's 1960s settings. The foreign models which these playwrights ape and mimic and carry a stigma, all these negative words, are apparently to be spurned. So this places Ravengai, it would appear, towards the conservative, traditionalist end of our spectrum, right? Elsewhere in the thesis, however, Ravengai is more sensitive to the entanglements and contradictions of the spectrum's middle. So he writes, and it's a longish quotation, "In staging the various performances, Africans both submitted to and resisted Rhodesian discourse, resulting in hybrid, ambivalent works that both mocked and celebrated colonialism. Cultural criticism in Zimbabwe has tended to apply the dominant hypothesis, which portrays the colonizer's power as absolute and having the propensity to dislocate and denature African culture. However, critics have failed to notice the spaces of resistance where they were apparent in African performances. The emergent hybridity was not just a literary and/or performance device, but a political project. The decolonization of theatre, then, is an ongoing dialectic between British cultural systems and Zimbabwean subversion of them." So I think the crucial phrase there is emergent hybridity. Everything's always emergent in some way, right? And I quite like that. And Ravengai has an agreeable conclusion. Consequently, it is not possible to create or recreate a national style of theatre wholly independent of its historical implication in the British colonial enterprise. So here he seems as subject to the unresolved tensions and ironies of post-colonial cultural production as the writers he discusses. He is himself an emergent hybrid, writing in English at UCT. So much for theory, all right, that's it. How does this manifest on the ground or on the stage? The Baobab School sort of experience can be doubtless paralleled 1,000-fold. So I'm just going to give you another couple of fun examples on the theatrical side. Michael Pearce writes a chapter in a book, Shakespeare, Race and Performance, on a Shona production of Two Gentlemen of Verona, entitled Vakomana Vaviri ve Zimbabwe. This was the work of a company named Two Gents, self-described as a cross-cultural touring company, which in fact consisted of exactly two gents, Zimbabwean-born but domiciled in London, Denton Chikura and Tonderai Munyevu. The play was performed around 2012 in various versions, including, interestingly, being back-translated from Shona, originally translated to Shona, and back-translated into another version of archaic-sounding but not quite Shakespearean English. A very, very odd sort of idea. And other performances with parts in both languages, Shona and English. Their director was a German, Arne Pohlmeier, who grew up in Cameroon. So a cosmopolitan ensemble indeed. They also produced Kupenga Kwa Hamlet, The Madness of Hamlet, staged in Harare in 2010. Now, these particular enterprises seem to have little of the political project whiff about them, and other apolitical responses concern Shakespeare's much vaunted humanism or universality, rather suspiciously regarded these decolonialized days. In 1956, for example, the emergent novelist Ndabazinhle Sigogo testified that Romeo and Juliet was a primary inspiration because it dealt with issues of arranged marriage which were affecting him personally at the time in his Indabele context. But subversive politics is never far from the surface. Another reason for Shakespeare's survival, indeed popularity in Zimbabwe, is outlined by Elizabeth Zaza Muchemwa, a local poet, playwright, and theatre director. The title of her own play, The Fourth Interrogation, hints at the subject of an article she wrote for the Index on Censorship. And this is a globally respected and important index on censorship around the planet. The article aired online in early April 2016. Muchemwa relates that in Harare Gardens, venue for the irregular performances of theatre in the park, A number of locally written plays had been censored, if not entirely shut down, by the ZANU-PF government. By 2016, the ruling party could wield a raft of self-generated laws to quell dissenting voices. The Censorship and Entertainment Act, the Access to Information and Protection of Privacy Act, infamous AYAPA, and the Public Order and Security Act, which are, Muchema writes, enacted as if purely to prohibit artistic expression that is deemed to be politically incorrect, of an improper sexual nature, or depicting any sexuality other than heterosexuality, or anything that demeans national heroes. Among the plays aired at Theatre in the Park was one called Super Patriots and Morons, which was performed in 2004 and depicted a senile head of state who refuses to let go of the reins of power. The play was soon banned. Performances of Shakespeare, by contrast, have regularly escaped scrutiny, despite their obvious parallels to current events. The parallels seem to be not lost on the audiences, completely lost on the government, which is really weird. Muchema notes that the Shakespearean texts that have been studied over the years in Zimbabwean high schools include King Lear, in which a senile king makes mistakes and was regarded as a commentary on state leaders who stay in power past their sell-by date, as she puts it. Julius Caesar, which pushes the idea of the people taking back the power and of betrayal. Hamlet, picture of succession struggles. And Twelfth Night and As You Like It, which have homoeroticism and some reversal of gender roles. Muchema writes, all these themes would raise the censorious eyebrows of the state if tackled in a modern play. Could it be Shakespeare's texts are allowed because the language is considered archaic and as such cannot possibly have a bearing on the mindset of the people it reaches? Playwright and arts critic Rezidon Baya, in the same issue of Index on Censorship, asserts, the censorship is more political than anything, used as a tool to intimidate and instill fear. With Shakespeare plays, you can adapt the text to speak to local experiences. We need to embrace Shakespeare. Now, just down the road from Harare Gardens and Theatre in the Park, 2 weeks after this was published, Muchema's article, another event occurred. It was reported in detail in the Herald that's the Harare Herald, not the PE Herald, of 27th of April 2016 by Bevan Tapureta. This, of course, was the 400th anniversary of the man Tapureta rather quaintly calls the late international thespian, commonly said to be the painter of nature and of man. In its Harare incarnation, the Shakespeare anniversary celebration spawned a riot of delightful ironies, incongruities, and juxtapositions. It was held, for starters, at the Alliance Française, which I'm sure Henry V would have objected to. But the director of the British Council, at least, was present. She mentioned that there had been widespread build-up around the country, including educational short films shown at various schools. So far, so ordinary. But a representative of the Pamberi Trust, an NGO, its youth development branch, noted that a hip-hop Shakespeare workshop had also been held. The Harare event similarly was dominated by the new wave of so-called spoken word, poetry performance. Indeed, there were no theatre directors or actors at all. There were some in the audience, though, and someone hoped that this odd omission would be rectified next time round. In the interim, Chirikure, who's quite a heavyweight in the Zimbabwean literary scene, invited audience members to come forward and recite their favorite Shakespeare quotations. Instead of the sweet strains of Renaissance harps or trumpets off, there was the melodious tweaking of mbiras and a jazz diva. As for the poetry itself, in between roof-raising jests by sundry comedians, several poems were recited in direct tribute to Shakespeare. Among others, a NAMA award-winning writer, Cynthia Marangwanda, who styles herself in her performance guise as Flow Child, it's child with a Y, very Renaissance. She recited a poem inspired by Romeo and Juliet, which she dedicated to all the Juliets out in the world, the beautiful, passionate women who suffer for choosing to follow their hearts. So Harare, Shakespeare, Milton Boon. The poem's persona is inspired by a woman she meets, I'm quoting the poem itself now, in the usual places, the mutual spaces where subcultures converge. It's interesting. Mutsa Shiripinda, aka Ray Lyric, testified that this celebration of Shakespeare is not something I take lightly, because I wouldn't be able to write with such gumption, or rather tenacity, if I hadn't read Macbeth and other works by Shakespeare. Tapureta reports, in terms of Shakespeare's poetry, I'm making a little segue here, in terms of Shakespeare's poetry, known as sonnets, Bika Mutsaurwa, aka Godobodi, had the generosity of explaining what a sonnet is. I hope I don't need to do that for you guys. Yeah? 14 lines, 3 quatrains, rhyming couplet. Yeah, okay. Before he did his Shakespearean ones, sonnets in the Shona language. So what's interesting in this whole event is that there appears not the slightest hint of anti-colonial ire or resentment, at least in Tapureta's reporting. Only a delighted and delightful syncretism of cultures, musics, genres, and languages. Anyway, so much for theatre, and we're making a little shift into poetry now, okay? So, the appearance, influence of, and response to Shakespeare and Zimbabwean poetry demonstrates the same range of responses across our notional spectrum. At the anti-colonial traditionalist end of the spectrum, we might begin with a well-known poet, Freedom Nyambaya, and this poem. One person said, "You are not a poet," but forgot that poetry is an art, and art is meaningful rhythm. Now, what is rhythm, if I may ask? Some say it's marching syllables. Others say it's marching sounds. But tell me how you marry the two. We fought Shakespeare on the battlefield. Blacks fought the Boers with their spears. These are marching syllables, and is art to some. But how can I marry the two? How about a different rhythm? It's not a great poem, and it posits Shakespeare as crudely iconic of white rule, or of whiteness generally, to be expunged, essentially. But there does seem to be in the poem an interesting debate going on, or a tension between rhythm as art and practical application of warlike marching rhythms, or to put it another way, between art for art's sake and art as socially pragmatic intervention, a tension which underlies a lot of post-colonial criticism. I wonder to what extent an evident critical concern with rhythm is an inheritance of Anglophone poetic education. I'm not sure how much debate is going on in Shona or Ndebele circles about that kind of technicality. Further research required. Because obviously Shona has its own rhythms, not to mention extremely subtle stress and tonal patterns, quite different from English. So what happens when there are these crossovers and these translations is, for me, the most interesting thing. As far as Shakespeare's influence is concerned, the 14-line sonnet takes center stage, so to speak. Get it? Takes center stage. I've never heard of a single person being influenced by Venus and Adonis, have you? Now, in the same 1966 collection I mentioned earlier, African Literature in Rhodesia, there are offered by Shona contributors brief analyses of Shona poems as they appeared in a collection published by the Literature Bureau. Among them are poems by Wilson Chivaura. Unfortunately, the poems themselves are not included, and my jejune and rusty Shona would not be up to analyzing them in any depth anyway. But it's clear from the descriptions that a number of the poems are arranged in stanzas and with identifiable rhyme schemes. And it's quite easy it's easier than English to rhyme in Shona because there are a lot of vowel endings of a similar kind. So it's interesting how they begin to play with that. Several are identified as directly influenced by Keats or Delamere or Tennyson, even though the subjects are quintessentially local. Some are sonnets, and at least one is evidently Shakespearean in its rhyme scheme with its closing couplet. Another is obviously Petrarchan with its octave sestet arrangement. All this is testament, no doubt, to Chivaura's anglicized education, in which Shakespeare is one thread, though not obviously a dominant one. So here's the question. Does Chivaura's effort demonstrate elements of craven mimicry, as our notional pure traditionalist might say? As one traditionalist, that end of the spectrum critic, does in fact put it, The dangers associated with this type of writing are aptly summed up by Muchemwa, I think is a different Muchemwa to Elizabeth Zaza, who writes thus: when a poet imitates the metropolitan models, one finds the metropolis implicitly giving orders, and the poet writes for an imaginary English-British audience. Muchemwa goes on, or the other critic goes on, sorry, I've lost his name somewhere. In conclusion, the sonnet's presentation of life violates Africans' way of understanding poetry and reality. Okay, so there's someone who wants to get rid of it. In Africa, rhythm is generated by context and occasion. Poetic form and rhythm are determined by what is being done to sustain life. This means understanding of poetic discourse and language depends on the activity at hand and the nature of the participants. It's kind of an echo of my schoolgirls extemporizing for their particular audiences, right? Far from a potentially slavish conformity to a prescribed pattern, 14 lines, AB rhyme or whatever, rhythm is here figured as an organic, malleable response to immediate life performance. And I find that energizing, to say the least. Or can we say that Chivaura's strategy is more helpfully viewed as a venture into new syncretic cross-cultural forms of a wonderful third space, as some critics have called it. This more inclusive or generous view might be exemplified by Lilibeth Hadebe's rather ponderous but appreciative analysis of two Ndebele poets' sonnets, Ndebele being the other major language of Zimbabwe, right? These two poets make interesting play with the 14-line format, sometimes ending with a clinching couplet. Hadebe makes much of sound effects, imagery, idiophones, in particular construction in many African languages, but nothing at all of rhythm or tonal patterns, and little of rhyme, though it's evident from the poems themselves that rhyme does occasionally emerge, though I don't see any with particular Shakespearean regularity. The question always is, I think, what balance is to be struck between a felt coercion by the literary power brokers who are pressing, if not dictating, what forms to follow, and on the other hand, the excitement generated by opportunity, by difference. Oh, here's a new form, we can do something with that in our own kind of way. Pache, the decolonialist, there is no single or stable reply here, I don't think. Much more troubled than Chivaura by this slippery divide come seam is the work of infamous badass Dambudzo Marachera, fitfully regarded as revoltingly manic or inspirationally maverick. If his prose piece called The Writer's Grain is anything to judge by, his preternaturally wide reading provoked ambivalent internal conflict. He writes, however much I try to be objective in my criticism of such eyesores as Kipling, Faulkner, Melville, Conrad, Shakespeare, in brackets, in Titus Andronicus, Othello, The Tempest, there was always at the back of my mind a smouldering discontent which one day would erupt, and he did so frequently erupt. The English language warred constantly with Shona within him, yet he found himself, quote, teaching the bloody language and the bloody literature, and also actually writing my novels in it. And he did affect this kind of pseudo-Oxonian accent, So part of him is going to one end of the spectrum, the other half of him is going to the assimilationist end of the spectrum. He's an interesting case. Writing poems in English too, he did, not just the novels. And not least his so-called sonnets to Amelia, which were first aired in 1988, the year after he died. John Eppel later published an interesting argument with Zimbabwean academic Drew Shaw. Eppel argued that Marachera's sonnets were fundamentally rather inferior, even incoherent, because, Marachera's own claims notwithstanding, he fails to demonstrate much finesse or control of rhyme or meter. In fact, none of the sonnets rhyme at all, nor show any other Shakespearean features, apart from some perhaps odd archaisms like thaniversary, what is that thing called? Apostrophe. and a few sentence inversions, which you might, at a stretch, attribute to Shakespearean influence. But Marechera did state that the Amelia sonnets deliberately inverted the notion of the dark lady avowedly lurking behind Shakespeare's poems, the black man now positing a white woman as lover. Drew Shaw, in contrast to Eppel, valorizes the poem's very shagginess as a valid kind of rebellion against precisely such constraints, a revelatory psychodrama of failed love that, according to Drew, questions the conventional subject matter of the sonnet. In fact, many sonnets are about unrequited love, so I'm not sure what he's on about there. So the black poets we find in this interesting middle ground, right? It can be conflictual, it can be more assimilationist, it can be more excited about the possibilities, it can be more resistant to the pressures and so on, okay? What about white poets? Naturally, one would expect English-speaking poets in Rhodesia, Zimbabwe, to be most eager to mimic their own forebears' poetic exemplars, without the kinds of cultural dislocations experienced by their Shona and Indabella countrymen. Yet they present the other side of the coin of cultural displacement and dis-ease. They're also culturally displaced in a way, and there are a lot of ironic undertones to their engagement with teaching foreign material to Africans and trying to write about Africans through obviously foreign modes. A few of these poets, not excluding myself, have tried their hands at writing sonnets, Shakespearean and otherwise. I do stress a few. A sort of lineage of white Rhodesian or Zimbabwean poets is conventionally drawn from Kingsley Fairbridge in the 1890s and Cullen Goldsberry a little later, through Arthur Shirley Cripps in the 1930s and 40s, to Noel Brettel in the 60s and 70s, to John Eppel in the present day. And it's a very kind of thin thread, and there are lots of other less well-known poets beavering away as well. But just as an indication, the first two, Fairbridge and Goldsberry, show no influence from Shakespeare whatsoever, being much closer to Kipling and other similar rollicking imperial songsters, and neither ever wrote a sonnet, as far as I know. Nor did the dour priest Cripps, who was a kind of displaced Neo-Georgian in style and preference. Now, Brettel, who wrote critical appraisals of both Fairbridge and Cripps, is particularly close to my heart because he lived for part of his life, as I did, in the mountains of eastern Zimbabwe. Like me, his contact with Shakespeare's school was tangential, though in his memoir, Sidegate and Style, which I think is still the most beautifully written of all Rhodesian Zimbabwean memoirs, he recalls one schoolmaster drilling in a line from Henry V about honeybees, surveys the singing masons building roofs of gold. A wonderful line. It's a wonderful passage. Later, he and his father found themselves attending a reading of The Merchant of Venice, from which Brettel happened to read out Lorenzo's taunt. "I shall answer that better to the Commonwealth than you can, the getting up of the Negro's belly. The Moor is with child by you, Lorenzo." Lancelot, rather. Brettel notes the archaic bawdry of this, but not the cross-racial scenario. Interesting. At a stretch, though, we might see this as an inadvertent foreshadowing, since Brettel eventually found himself, as Cripps had, and as I did, and as Eppel does, teaching Shakespeare in a series of rural schools, English, Afrikaner, and Shona. He much enjoyed the pastime of play acting, and it seemed to him natural and inevitable that he should turn to Shakespeare, including a staging of A Midsummer Night's Dream, partly translated into Afrikaans. I'm not going to dare to read any of it. Now, Brettel's most relevant poetic foray in this direction is the poem African Student, subtitled Shakespeare for A-Level. It's a complex, somewhat elusive poem, but one sensitive in its own way to the cultural tensions of the then almost post-colony. It's quite a long poem, and I'll just read a little bit of it. Here's the first section. The pressure lamp hisses into the silence, the narrow radius of sufficiency. Mousefoot, moth flutter, bat's wing, fumble and twitch, the foolscap shadows of the thatch. Black scholar, intent, impassive still, you have no place in time or language. As pages rapidly flicking, you turn from text to gloss to commentary. Though the student, impoverished in his conditions, yet timelessly absorbed in his text, must or might make something of the imaginary lands of Illyria or Arcady that Shakespeare mentions, so different from his own uncouth landscape, as Brettel called it. His studying still leaves questions hung like cobwebs. In a way, the poet seems to regret this scholarly growth into knowledge, not because he wants to repress the student, but because a certain boyish freedom might be lost. So he writes in the poem, "Keep your wild hills for roaming. The land is innocent still, so keep innocency. Keep the half-naked thing you were, a little tiny boy." This is perhaps too simply read as patronizing, though it has that element, I think. Brettel certainly clung to a somewhat anachronistic idea of Africa, wild Africa, as innocent, whatever that might mean. It went along with a somewhat jaded view of the advance of the very so-called civilization he belonged to and was helping to disseminate through teaching Shakespeare. So the ironies run deep here. The vision of the poem's last section is both more realist and more egalitarian. Together, eye for eye, we stare into the dark. That darkness does then tilt hopefully towards some dawn, some hope that Shakespeare's dislocated and dislocating tales of clown and duke and dunce might eventually form a chorus, something of togetherness. And the poem ends tentatively, a cobweb of uncertainty, if you like. Could you or I, with honesty, endure that golden franchise that embraced them all, the knave, the gull, the Jew, the blackamoor? I assume the golden franchise to be the vast scope of human character and circumstance that constitutes Shakespeare's works, a reflection of the fractured, racially divided world both poet and scholar must face and possibly transcend, as Shakespeare faced and possibly transcended. Okay, apart from other passing references, Brettel wrote two other poems centered on Shakespeare, Othello at Stratford and I, You and Cymbeline. Neither refers to life in Zimbabwe and have been intensively explored by another once upon a time resident, Greg Haxey. I'm going to skip on to our last white poet, the prolific John Apple. Like Brettel, Apple is deeply wedded to form as part of his poetic craft and heritage, and deploys a wide variety of stanza arrangements and traditional forms, preeminently the sonnet. Even as Apple habitually probes the meaning of white belonging in the post-colony, he uses these Eurocentric forms unabashedly. Probably most of what needs to be said is captured in this extract from his recent interview with Drew Shaw. John Apple says, "After all, I am an African European. The sonnet, as you know, originated in Italy and was made famous by Petrarch in the 14th century. Its theme was unrequited love. Hence, Marechera wasn't doing anything particularly innovative in that sense. When in the 16th century it was imported by other European countries, it was adapted to other themes, like religion, John Donne, politics, John Milton, and nature, William Wordsworth. One of my favorite poets is John Keats, and he wrote marvelous sonnets like To Sleep and Bright Star. I learned to write sonnets by reading these great practitioners of the form, none greater than Shakespeare. To use an analogy from the visual arts, the sonnet form is the frame of my canvas upon which I paint words. And I'm very much at home with the iambic pentameter line. But Apple is not entirely slavish either. He's especially adept at preserving the strictest forms while delivering a register so everyday, almost chatty, so naturally run on that the strictures scarcely emerge. But they're there. You'll hear this as I read one of his sonnet sequence at Hillside Dams. And he also posits a kind of transitional, liminal position, scene, as he crosses the dam wall at Hillside Dams, which is both a barrier and a bridge, right? So I think he echoes Marechera interestingly in that sense. It's a kind of cultural, natural, existential exploration all at once. See what you make of it. It's a kind of carpe diem poem for me in the end. A search for, as was Freedom Nyambaya's poem, a different rhythm, a third space. Its rhyme structure is Shakespearean. The line not quite regularly iambic, but impeccably decasyllabic. Counts every syllable, does John. But listen to how kind of smooth and conversational it is. The title, of course, teases Keats. The title being Beauty is Truth, Truth, Death. So here's the poem. When I negotiate rocks that divide and unite upper and lower dams, I feel that I'm being taken for a ride on some lopsided insect, a mothfly perhaps, or a dark predaceous water beetle, tilted not by geology but by wind, a regular rip snorter at this time of seasonal change, a free-for-all between your legs, between liquid upper and solidifying lower, earth and sea, there on the threshold, a bid not to prayer but to pleasure, a knower finally of the truth. Beauty is death. So, put down your pen and take a deep breath. Slightly naughty about that, I don't know. I said Epple would be my last white poet, but there's just one more. I mentioned earlier that I had also sonneted, so I'm going to be self-indulgent again. We've spoken quite a bit about translation, which occurs not only between languages, but also between whole cultural consciousnesses, right? And as everyone knows, every translation, however apt, is also a kind of failure, a departure from the original, an impurity of some sort, a movement into a different space. The idea of that third space can nevertheless carry one, I think, into unexpectedly fruitful, even beautiful territory. Now, it's very, very strange. It was completely unplanned. Malvern mentioned that sonnet sequence that I wrote in 2005. Karen Press and I were invited to join a bunch of Portuguese poets and translators at a count's castle in northern Portugal, I kid you not, to have our poems translated into Portuguese and published in both languages. Never happened for some reason. I never saw the results. I don't know what happened. I think the count might have died or something. Anyway, it was an interesting experience. Karen's poems translated blissfully. Mine proved much more resistant. Self-consciously, while I was there, I began to write this series of sonnets, which I called the 14 Sonnets Amongst the Portuguese. The title alludes to Elizabeth Barrett Browning and Roy Campbell rather than Shakespeare. But one or two of the varied arrangements I tried out are Shakespearean. So this one, which I will end on, is entitled Translation 1, An Argument in Portuguese, which captures quite a bit, I think, of what I've been trying to say. And like an idiot, I had this printed in amazingly small print. So, Translation 1, An Argument in Portuguese. It burst out, the argument. Unintelligible now, eloquent hands knifing up like crow's wings on a roadkill. Blunt disagreements clashing. The dictionaries are ransacked. The laptop rattles its bones. I am redundant. My old poem lies between us, inert, as if unclothed, as if silently crying, "Are you vultures or midwives?" How do I now remain pure? Wouldn't you also loathe such an exhumation, such assumptions of foreign lives? Nuno, one of the translators, was wrong. Some things are untranslatable. Dossy shit. Gimbals. Flaps. Though the air is charged with smoky possibilities, they resist. Around the table, heads shake. The phrase must be dropped or changed utterly, if anything's to remain of the truthful. And Fatima is laughing at the failure. The failure is beautiful. Thank you very much for listening.